Steve Pratte, who's the policy director for the canola growers. And I might also add the current president of the CTRF. And while I'm at it, I'll recognize Malcolm Cairns, who's also watching, who's another former president of the CTRF. So we're very well represented here today in that organization.
Thank you, Barry. And welcome to session number 3, Shovels in the Ground Processing Investments. So this afternoon, we'll have 2 presenters, and they're going to be exploring and discussing the topic of processing investment with a lens and a focus from their particular commodity, being pulses and canola, respectively. So in terms of a format, as you've already seen throughout the course of the day, we'll have both presenters provide their remarks, then we'll open the floor at the end for questions, comments, and discussion. And again, you can put your comments into the chat format, and I can pose the questions to the panelists, or we can open the line for verbal questions and dialogue if you prefer. So in my view, this is a very timely presentation, as those working in the industry or those observing it, they can well appreciate there's been an uptick in activity in the Western Canadian value add processing sector in the last several years, and an incredible package of investments recently announced in the canola sector, specifically in 2021 by a group of major players. And this recent suite of investments in processing of a number of grain commodities will certainly drive change in the Canadian agricultural sector, and they'll have a range of positive spin-off effects for the companies involved, the local and broader Canadian economy, and certainly they'll provide further marketing opportunities for the products of Canadian farmers. And again, it'll also impact the nature of transportation demand for the end products in terms of the direction of travel due to market diversification potentially. There'll be impacts on the specific mode of transport, be it road or rail, and the means of conveyance depending on the nature of the product and the economies of scale involved. So, so is it going to be a rail hopper car, it's going to be an oil car, shipping containers, totes, bags and trucks, etc. So I'm confident that our 2 presenters this afternoon will leave us with a better appreciation of the current developments, their underlying economic drivers, and the implications for the value chain from farmers to end users. So with that as a bit of a preamble, let's first turn to our first presentation focused on the pulse sector. So I'm pleased to introduce this afternoon Janelle Courcelles, who's the Director, Quality and Processing at Pulse Canada, responsible for identifying and addressing priority research gaps that impede growth of the pulse ingredient sector. Janelle holds a Master's of Science in Food Science with expertise on genetic and environmental influences affecting ingredient quality and analytical techniques to evaluate ingredient performance. She currently oversees marketing, technical, and research initiatives related to pulse quality for processing, milling, and fractionation. So welcome, Janelle, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction here, Steve. I actually had the pleasure of speaking last year at this event, so it's great to be back here again, although virtually still. All right, so as it was mentioned before, I'm going to be talking about growth of the pulse and post-processing sector here in Canada. So before I start off here, I just wanted to briefly introduce our organization. So I'm with Pulse Canada, which is the national association that represents the growers, traders, and processors of Canadian pulses. And a major focus of our organization is to support and contribute to profitability of the Canadian pulse industry. So really a lot of the work that we do is kind of focused into 2 working streams, one being to create efficiencies, and that is by working to eliminate barriers to trade and ensure continued market access in key export regions for Canadian pulses, as well as to keep crop protection products available to our farmers and advocate for the improvement of domestic grain transportation. The second working stream, and this is the team that I myself am a part of, is really to focus on building demand for pulses as well as pulse ingredients. And a lot of the work that we do on this team is to build scientifically backed information that helps companies leverage the benefits of pulses throughout their process, as well as to facilitate projects that highlight pulses specifically in terms of their advantages, as well as to address common industry challenges. So we at Pulse Canada, we're supported by our members, which include 4 provincial grower organizations, and those are shown here on this slide, as well as industry members. So this includes trade, export, processors, as well as ingredient processors, and they are represented through their involvement in the Canadian Special Crops Association. We also leverage a lot of our member contributions through provincial and federal programs that are available through the Canadian government. So we are here right now to talk about pulses. So why pulses? There really is a number of benefits that are associated with them. They have health benefits that are associated with whole pulse consumption. They are a nutritious ingredient, being very rich in protein, high in fiber, as well as vitamin and minerals. And being a nitrogen fixing crop, there's a number of sustainability benefits that are associated with their production, giving them a low carbon footprint. They help to contribute to soil health, as well as they're being very well adapted to semi-arid environments and have really good water use efficiency. So all of these benefits can be later transferred to the following year as part of crop rotation benefits here in Canada. So when we're talking about pulses in the Canadian context, in terms of volume, we grow significantly more amount of peas and lentils than some other pulse types, but we still do grow chickpeas and some common bean varieties that you see listed here on this slide. And in terms of where they're grown, with the exception of a lot of the bean growth being done in Ontario, most of the pulse production takes place in the Canadian prairies, where lentils specifically, most of that production is done in Saskatchewan, with some in Alberta, and peas being pretty evenly distributed throughout the Canadian prairie provinces. So pulse production itself in Canada has been taking place for over 100 years. However, it didn't really play a significant role up until the 1970s and 80s, where farmers were really encouraged to diversify their crop rotations beyond just wheat. And with growth in the production numbers in the following years, it was really supported by the development of new varieties that were well acclimatized to the Canadian climate, as well as the registration of crop protection products, which all helped to contribute to this nice substantial growth in production that you see here on this slide. Around the 2000s in particular is where we started to see a lot more investments by the pulse industry beyond some more traditional avenues of research, which would have been historically crop breeding and agronomics, into different uses of pulses. So here we're starting to see more investments into developing pulse processing, as well as identifying and highlighting new uses for pulse ingredients. So over the past 5 years or so, pulse production has really increased successfully to where we produce on average about 7 million tons annually, with the exception of this past growing season as a result of the drought conditions. But all of this leads to Canada really sitting behind India as the world's second largest producer of pulse crops, accounting for about 10% of global pulse production. And in terms of what we grow here in Canada, over 85% of this is exported, leading to Canada being the world's top exporter of pulse crops. And annually, we export approximately 6 million metric tons of pulses every year globally. So although we do export to over 130 different countries, over 60% of these exports are concentrated in either the China or Indian subcontinent. So this can lead to potentially greater risks for our industry. And a really good example of that is from 2007 to 2017. India was Canada's largest export market for Canadian peas, and India accounted for approximately 43% of total Canadian pea exports during that time period. But in 2017, India imposed a 50% tariff on Canadian pea imports, followed by a 2018 imposition of a quantity restriction on pea imports. So effectively, with both of those measures still in place, that has removed India as a key market for Canadian peas. So following this, China has since become the largest import market for Canadian peas. And just for an example, in 2020, 70% of our pea exports went into the Chinese market. And of the total peas that were coming into China, Canada represented about 94% of that. And that is primarily due to competing origins not having market access to this Chinese market. So here you can really see the shift in pulse exports from India to China as a result of that 2014 tariff imposition, where Canada really was able to divert a significant volume of these Canadian peas into this new market. However, this closure of India really serves as a prime example of the risk of being over-reliant on a single market for export. And there are also several factors within the Chinese environment that threaten Canada's current market share. Specifically, China has a focus on import diversification, and they are really looking to expand the source of peas from 2 different exporting regions, as well as there are some concerns about geopolitical tension with the COVID pandemic, we're also seeing rising concerns from the Chinese government in regards to things like food quality and food safety. Within the global trade environment, we are also seeing increased trade barriers for Canadian pulses, including a shift away from traditional rules-based trading systems. So there are often times where current free trade agreements are underperforming as countries are finding new ways to keep product out, including the implementation of non-tariff trade barriers. And coinciding with the COVID pandemic, there is also a shift to protectionism where we're seeing increased efforts to establish self-sufficient supply chains within regions, as well as countries like the EU are taking a very precautionary approach to phytosanitary requirements and to regulate pesticides, which runs the risk of influencing other countries' decisions and could harm Canada's competitiveness within this global trade environment. And although I'm not necessarily going to touch on it here today, as it's been really well covered throughout today's event, but the container crunch is absolutely affecting our industry in terms of getting our capabilities of getting pulses to overseas markets. So all of this to say, as we're seeing increasing trade barriers arising for Canadian pulses, it's definitely important to diversify the end uses for what we grow beyond some of these conventional bulk export markets. So in 2017, the Canadian pulse industry came together to develop a diversification strategy, which targeted an incremental use of 25% of Canadian pulses into new use categories by the year 2025. So each of these new uses and opportunities are unique depending on the pulse type that you're talking about. However, we do have a focus now on value-added processing. So this is stuff like flour milling and fractionation, as well as diverting whole use into different areas. So avenues like food service and retail consumption. We also see the opportunity to encourage sustainable feed and using pulses as a livestock feed source. So here we're going to switch gears and now talk about what we're here for is growth in the processing sector. So in terms of pulse processing, there are a number of different techniques that can be applied from the whole seed to fractions. And this diagram here represents some of the more common processing techniques and the ingredients that can be derived from each. So here we can go anywhere from very simple processing, which is simply removing the seed coat that's found on that pulse seed. And that seed coat itself can be ground down, and being a very rich source of fiber, you can actually add that into foods as a dietary fiber additive. You can then, that inner portion of the seed is split, and that's a really good way to consume pulses whole in a retailed or canned form. But further from there, very similar to cereal grains, we get milling of pulses where, depending on the particle size, you can get different types of ingredients like flours, grits, and flakes. And even more so, what we're starting to see a lot more of these investments arising is in fractionation. And this can be done using dry or wet methods, the biggest difference being in the purity of the ingredients that they're producing. But this is where we're getting the separation of those internal seed components into things like proteins, starches, and fibers. So growth of the pulse ingredient processing sector has really coincided with growth in production, as we're beginning to really ensure that processors can have a consistent supply of input for their process. And this chart specifically is highlighting the number of companies in Canada that have the capacity to process either a flour or a fraction from pulses. And this is overlaid with the production of Canadian pulses in the background here. So as we're seeing more and more facilities come into play over the years, it also follows that the processing capacity here in Canada has increased. So in 2005, we had a little under 50,000 metric tons of whole seed capacity to process pulses. And this has grown to an estimated 600,000 ton capacity to date. And we expect this to continue growing with a lot of these new announcements and processing facilities that keep on coming to the news here today. But I did want to mention that even beyond this, ingredient processing in Canada has existed since the 1980s. So this history of pulse processing has really established a good ecosystem in Canada where there's a lot of extensive expertise in all aspects related to pulse processing quality. And there really is an impressive list of multiple disciplinary fields here in Canada, anywhere from crop breeding specifically for processing related quality parameters, nutrition to food chemistry, as well as processing of pulses. So to put this into perspective too from other international players, a lot of these big companies that are existing in Europe or in the States didn't really get into processing until the 1990s or early 2000s. So Canada really does have a good history and a lot of expertise in pulse processing that can continue to support growth in this sector. So although the processing capacity did exist earlier on, there really wasn't a lot of development until the mid 2000s, and 2005 marks a significant year for our industry, as that's when the Canadian pulse industry implemented a market development strategy. So this is where we begin to put efforts into diversifying pulse utilization beyond some of these traditional consumption methods that is that bulk export. So as part of these efforts, the industry has been continuously advocating the benefits of pulses, and this is through direct partnerships with individual food companies, in-person events that are focused exclusively on pulses, as well as striving to develop publicly accessible knowledge that really speaks to the benefits of pulse quality, nutrition, health, and sustainability. In 2007, we started to see the first milestone of many significant milestones in the Canadian pulse processing industry, where AGT Foods, which is typically a major bulk pulse exporter, invested in a Canadian ingredient research facility specifically focused on developing these pulse protein ingredients. And this later led to the commissioning of a commercial facility across the border, which now currently produces a lot of these pulse ingredients, and they are a major stakeholder here in this side of the industry. It's really interesting to note that a lot of this growth in pulse processing really took off after the first appearance of the term plant-based being positioned on food packaging labeling, which first appeared in 2015. So at this point in time, we're seeing a lot more companies becoming familiar with pulses as a plant-based source of protein and being a very nutritious ingredient. In this very same year, we saw a new company, Pratte, be established, which is really interesting because this is a company now that's focused solely on fava bean ingredients, where historically a lot of these processed ingredients were pea-based. So it's starting to mark innovation in the pulse processing sector in terms of the pulse types that are being utilized. In 2016, this marked the United Nations International Year of the Pulse, and this was really meant to push and expand awareness of pulses and all of their health and sustainability benefits globally. And this year was particularly significant as all of the planning that went behind it really facilitated a number of connections and collaborations among the pulse industry internationally. After this point here, this is where we start to see a lot more developments in Canada, where in 2017, this was the year the pulse industry launched its diversification strategy that I mentioned before, which has a specific call out to value-added processing. And this is the year that we also saw announcements for two major investments into Canadian processing facilities. And this is very particularly exciting as these investments were made from international companies that were putting that decision to make that investment into Canada. So the following year, again, we're seeing more and more development in terms of investments and partnerships that are being announced in the Canadian industry, as well as the Government of Canada announcing the Protein Supercluster Initiative through Innovative Science and Economic Development Canada. So this is a really exciting point in the history of pulse processing, as there's a lot more capital now that's accessible to really help and encourage growth within the sector. So the following year is when Protein Industries Canada announced its first funding project, and then we saw the announcement of another new Canadian fill facility, Merit Functional Foods. And since then, there has been more and more companies that are being announced, and we're expected the processing capacity in North America here to reach approximately 1 million tons in the near future. So as there are now a lot of different ways to consume pulses and their derived ingredients, I really wanted to highlight here that there is a lot of different ways in which we can transport these ingredients. So this is anywhere from direct road to trucking. We're seeing bulk containerized shipments that are going overseas to offshore customers. But with growth in processing, I would say the biggest difference that we're seeing is rather farmers selling directly to elevators who then make the decision to ship overseas or sell by truck within North America. We're now seeing a lot more farmers working directly with these processors. So here, I just wanted to highlight a couple of different ways in which some of these companies are working with farmers. So this is just a snapshot for Avena Foods and Roquette Canada. Their website has a specific call out in order to establish a really good working relationship with some of our Canadian farmers. A really interesting opportunity with Prairie Fava. They worked very closely with seed breeder DL Seeds, and now they own the exclusive license to a fava bean variety that's really well suited to making fava bean ingredients for food development. A really interesting project here. So this is another project funded by Protein Industries Canada, and it's a collaboration between Farmers Edge and Merit Functional Foods. And this is really a pilot program to begin to create more transparency to what's going on at the farm level and really relate that to that protein ingredient that they're producing. So all in all, the biggest shift in this increased processing capacity is a shift to sourcing directly from farmers. And the really big benefit here is that traceability. This is something that consumers are really demanding for as part of purchasing decisions. We're also seeing that some of these companies then can influence some of the crop management practices by having good relationships with farmers. So just for an example here, if there are allergy concerns, you can get farmers to not have grown soy or wheat within a 2-year period for that pea product specifically. And we're also seeing now certain companies that are beginning to source specific varieties of peas where historically this wasn't the case. A pea would be mixed, it would just be a yellow pea. You wouldn't necessarily have a specific variety called out. And I've included here a snapshot of a project that I'm involved with at Pulse Canada, which is looking at environmental and genotype differences of yellow pea varieties. And this is looking at protein content specifically. So you can see here, there are a number of varieties which typically yield a higher protein content. And these are the ones that some of these fractionators are really interested in because it can affect their process specifically when they're looking to make that protein ingredient. So all in all, what happens when we get these ingredients? There is a number of different applications. All of these pulse ingredients really fit into a lot of different sectors within the food industry. So fiber ingredients, for example, they're very suitable for bakery just in terms of fortifying to ramp up that fiber content. And they also work really well in smaller amounts as a functional ingredient in meat, where you can add a fiber into that system and they help to improve the cooking properties of that meat product. And on the protein side of things, there's definitely a lot of use in the meat alternative sector, but they can also be used in dairy applications as well as in bakery. On the flour side of things, very conventional to what you would see wheat flour be used for, where we're seeing bakery applications, but there's also opportunities for new products like red lentil pasta, for example, which you might be able to find here at the grocery store. The starch is definitely the big industry challenge right now, where for every unit of protein, you produce 2 to 3 times that amount of starch. So our industry is very much looking at different opportunities to utilize higher volumes of the starch product with a new focus on non-food uses for starch. So things like utilizing it in bioplastics or paper and packaging. So this is just numbers for pea protein utilization, but I really wanted to show the growth in what we've seen in the past 5 years, where just for pea protein alone, this use in North America specifically has almost tripled since 2015. And this is for a number of different industries. I know we see a lot in the media about these meat substitutes and meat alternatives and whether or not they're actually going to take off and become as big as everybody's saying. But here, I just think it's really interesting to highlight that in terms of volume use for pea protein, this is a really small industry. So whether or not it makes it or breaks it, I think there's still opportunities to continue to use some of these pea protein ingredients in other areas of the food sector. When we start to look at it compared to other sources of proteins, the use of pea protein is still really small. So I think this really speaks to the opportunity that our industry has in order to capitalize on some of this market. There's a lot of room for us to grow and really expand and begin to specialize in producing pea proteins. I know it was mentioned earlier, Merit's pea protein works really well in beverage applications, but perhaps we can get new processors coming up and running that'll be specialized for a meat alternative application, for example. So I think all in all to say there's more to come for the pulse industry, and it's definitely a really exciting time here.
Okay, thank you, Janelle. Yeah, that's a lot of food for thought. So folks, keep your questions. You can start entering them in the chat or keep them to yourself, and we can address them following Chris's presentation. But a lot to unpack there, and I'm sure we can get some good conversation going. So pivoting from the pulse sector, let us turn our focus for the next little bit to the canola sector. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Chris Vervaet. He's Executive Director of the Canadian Oilseed Processors Association, representing its matters pertaining to the oilseed processing industry. Chris also serves as a Senior Executive for the Canola Council of Canada. He's worked at various levels within the agricultural industry for over 20 years in both a domestic and international capacity. And just by way of a bit of background, prior to joining COPA and the council in 2015, Chris spent 7 years working for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada as a market access and trade specialist, including 4 years as agricultural counselor at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. Earlier in his career, he served as a director of trade policy for the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and as a trade analyst for Bunge Global. Chris holds a Master's of Science in Agricultural Economics from the University of Guelph and a Bachelor of Science in Agribusiness from the University of Manitoba. So welcome, Chris, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Steve.
There we go.
Yeah, all right, thank you. And thanks for the kind introduction, Steve. Happy to be here again. It's been a couple of years since I've had the opportunity to present to the Fields on Wheels conference and its attendees. So thank you again for the invitation. My presentation is going to be focusing on canola processing expansion in Canada. But before I tuck into the presentation itself, just very briefly, the Canadian Oilseed Processors Association is an industry association representing the interest of canola and soybean processors in this country. We work in close partnership with the Canola Council of Canada to advance the interests of the sector more broadly. Again, really through the lens of wanting to grow the industry, and we're certainly seeing a lot of growth in the recent months, and that's going to be the focus of my presentation this afternoon. So I'll jump right into it with regards to the expansion. So this slide demonstrates the assets or the facilities of oilseed processing across this country. Currently, there are 14 processing facilities in Canada, represented by 6 member companies, and those are ADM, Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, Richardson's, and Viterra. The facilities in the eastern part of the country are what we call swing plants. So they are able to crush both canola and soybeans into vegetable oil and meal. And then the facilities that you see in the prairie provinces are dedicated facilities for crushing canola only. Combined, the capacity of these 14 facilities is 11 million metric tons of canola a year. And there's an additional capacity of 2 million tons of soybean a year. But we're here to talk about what's coming down the pike as it relates to new processing investments. And we have those indicated on this map as well, and they are as follows in no particular order. Cargill has announced a facility in Regina. We have another announcement by Viterra, also with canola crush capacity in Regina, and Richardson's making an announcement again this year to expand their crush capacity in Yorkton. And then finally, Ceres Global, a relatively new player to canola crushing, making an announcement again earlier this year for a crush plant in Northgate, Saskatchewan. So all of the announcements together would total roughly an additional 5.7 million metric tons of crush capacity for canola, and all centered in Saskatchewan, which is by no means an accident. Saskatchewan is centrally located with access to many different markets as a result, but is also the province where we see most of the canola grown. So as I said, currently the crush capacity for canola from coast to coast is about 11 million metric tons. So doing the simple math, we are going to be approaching close to 17 million metric tons of total canola crush capacity by 2025, should all of these announcements come to fruition. And that represents a 50% increase from the current levels. So what are the opportunities from expanded crush? And I'll go through this slide relatively briefly, but I thought it was important to highlight these benefits early on in the presentation. First and foremost, it does create more competition for canola seed, which does raise the overall value of canola in this country. And it also provides increased delivery options and flexibility for farmers. So instead of 14 processing facilities, there would notionally be the opportunity to deliver to 17, in addition to the expansive network of elevators that exist in the prairies. And just to pick up on what Janelle covered off in her presentation, market diversification. This is such a big opportunity as it relates to more value-added processing in Canada. It does provide an opportunity for value-added marketing for both oil and meal. It supports value-added production and job creation in Canada. I think that's one of the top priorities, regardless of what industry you're in. The governments across this country are looking for more value-added jobs and job creation, and more crush expansion or more crush capacity certainly does that. It encourages investment and innovation in canola varieties and agronomic practices. So think about maybe different opportunities with regards to innovation in canola from an oil content point of view. And then lastly, it supports Canadian biofuel investments and greenhouse gas emission reductions. And my subsequent slides are going to be talking a little bit more about biofuels because it is one of the major drivers and catalysts for this recent influx of crush expansion announcements. So before I get into biofuels as an investment driver, just fundamentally recognizing that we operate in a global market and our products do end up in many different markets around the world, the key investment driver fundamentally still is global demand for oil and meal. And the two charts on this slide demonstrate what that growth trajectory has been for both oil and meal throughout the years. So when you look at the past decade, we just see very steady growth for both oil and meal to several different markets around the world. China continues to be an important market and driver for growth for both oil and meal. We see that continuing. North America, both Canada and the US combined, also an important market, perhaps plateaued a little bit in terms of what our opportunities have been for growth in the United States, but we see that changing again as we look to the biofuel market for really driving some of the growth going forward. And the next 4 or 5 slides are going to unpack this biofuel story in a little bit more detail. So biofuel demand. Biofuels, whether it's biodiesel or something that's relatively new in terms of renewable diesel, is really set to take off in the coming years as governments are looking for every opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. And there's a positive role that canola can play in that space. So before I do start to unpack some of these policies that are driving biofuel demand in North America, you heard me mention biodiesel and renewable diesel. Perhaps this is a good opportunity to make the distinction between those two products because I will be talking about bio and renewable diesel over the next few slides. So biodiesel is something I think many are familiar with. It is what is currently the predominant biofuel derived from canola and other vegetable oils. It does have some limitations with regards to it being blended into conventional diesel, but it's something that is quite common in terms of what we're familiar with when we talk about biofuels. Renewable diesel is relatively, I wouldn't even call it a new product, but it's really starting to take off with regards to its production. It is also using different feedstocks like canola oil, soybean oil, used cooking oil. But the difference between renewable diesel and biodiesel is that renewable diesel is chemically identical to conventional fossil diesel. So there are no limits in blending. The existing infrastructure that's used to store conventional diesel and transport conventional diesel can all be utilized for the purposes of renewable diesel. And that's probably renewable diesel's biggest advantage over biodiesel, and why I think, again, I'll unpack this a little bit more in subsequent slides, but the future as it relates to opportunities for canola and other vegetable oils to be used in biofuels. So the slide that's in front of everybody we'll attempt to just to paint a picture here with regards to where the demand for biodiesel and renewable diesel are coming from. And it's largely a policy-driven demand. The way that I like to frame it sometimes is the biofuel market is a created market. It's not a natural market. It does rely on government biofuel policies and regulations to create the incentives for these types of low carbon fuels to be used. And the best example in terms of, where we've really seen a lot of growth in biofuel demand recently is in California's low carbon fuel standard. And the principle of this particular regulation in California, which has been in place for the last 10 years, is that it mandates a lower carbon intensity for the fossil fuels that are sold and combusted in that state. So every year, the fossil fuel suppliers have to lower the carbon intensity of the fuel that they sell. And the best way that is achieved is through the blending of low carbon fuels like renewable diesel and biodiesel. And we've certainly seen that transpire in California over the last 10 years, where renewable diesel in particular, which is the dark green bar, has had significant growth over the last 10 years in California. In fact, in California entirely, as a result of the low carbon fuel standard, the renewable fuels consumption has increased from about 1 billion liters to more than 2 billion liters. So more than a doubling in terms of consumption of renewable fuels in that particular market. Turning closer to home, that concept of a low carbon fuel standard is being replicated around the world in terms of lowering that carbon footprint of fossil fuels, globally. And in Canada, the federal government has been developing a similar regulation to what we see in California, calling it the Clean Fuel Standard or the Clean Fuel Regulation. And as the canola industry and as canola crushers, we certainly see the potential for the Clean Fuel Standard to replicate that demand signal for bio and renewable diesel in Canada as well. What you see in front of you is just some different demand scenarios on the right-hand side of the screen with regards to what we could see for bio-renewable diesel demand, by 2030. So under a medium scenario, perhaps that's the best to focus on, where we currently see demand for bio and renewable diesel of just under 1 billion liters today, could certainly grow to north of 2 or even 2.5 billion liters by 2030. So sticking to the biofuel story, again, this is a scenario. This is by no means, hard numbers. This requires just some estimates and forecasts, but looking at kind of that medium demand scenario for biofuels in North America, there's certainly a potential to see the demand for bio and renewable diesel increase by 50% over the next 8 or 9 years, where we see the total demand reach perhaps 15 billion liters come 2030. And with all that projected demand or the demand growth that's happened over the last decade, again, certainly in the United States, with California being the driver, we have seen the supply response in an amazing way, frankly, as it relates to different companies making investments in renewable diesel. And these aren't the traditional companies that have made investments in biofuels in the past. Most of the investments that are being made in the United States are being made by the oil and gas industry players. So the likes of Marathon, Phillips 66, Valero, Holly Frontier, the list is actually quite long. There are many oil and gas members of the industry that are looking to decarbonize the fuels that they produce. And they have started to make a big bet as it relates to renewable diesel and using more renewable diesel in transportation fuels in the United States. The chart on the right gives a snapshot of what that production, what these investments from these different companies means from a total output or a capacity perspective over the next 2 or 3 years. Currently, the renewable diesel production capacity in the United States is just north of about 1 billion gallons a year. And when you look at the map on the left-hand side and all those different companies listed, if those announcements come to fruition and all that capacity does get constructed, the growth in renewable diesel production capacity in the United States it could be truly remarkable and game-changing. So growing from 1 billion today to close to 5 billion gallons is the potential by 2024. So not to be outdone, and as I said, Canada also has some policies that are coming down the pike as it relates to incentivizing more utilization of biofuels and low carbon fuels in the transportation sector. There's been a supply response in our country as well. And again, the supply response is primarily coming from those that are in the traditional oil and gas space. So we have Tidewater in British Columbia recently making an announcement for renewable diesel production. We have Imperial making a very impressive announcement in Edmonton out of their refinery in Strathcona. There's been some discussion around a possible biofuel plant, renewable diesel plant being built by a federated co-op in Saskatchewan. All that to say, the Canadian players are starting to make investment announcements in the renewable diesel space as well. And where we see currently essentially zero production of renewable diesel in Canada, it could grow to as much as close to 3 billion liters by 2024. So what does this all mean for canola, and how does this all back up in terms of expanded crush for our industry? The demand for biofuels, I think I've painted that picture quite clearly. It's still a scenario, it's a forecast. We don't know for sure what is going to happen with regards to all those investments and whether all that demand comes to fruition. But if we were to extrapolate from some of those forecasts on the biofuel growth side, here's a forecast or a scenario of what that could mean for canola demand. And this is in seed equivalent. But currently for North American biofuels, about 1.8 million tons of canola seed is used in primarily biodiesel production in North America. We could see a fourfold increase in the next decade to see 6.5 million tons of seed used for biofuels by 2030. So just a little bit about the targets that the canola industry has set and where we see the crush industry going vis-a-vis seed exports and canola production. As I said at the outset of the presentation, COPA works very close with the Canola Council of Canada, and the Canola Council of Canada and its different segments of the value chain have set targets for canola going out to 2025. The most important target, I would argue, is to be able to reach 26 million metric tons of canola production by that time, 14 million metric tons of crush, and 12 million metric tons of seed exports. We have confidence that the canola production target is still attainable. You've heard me already talk about the expanded crush. So we actually see, the crush capacity reaching close to maybe 17 million metric tons. And in reality, that could mean as much as 15 million metric tons of actual processing. So there's certainly the potential for our sector to blow right past the 14 million metric ton target. Exports are already actually at target. So the future growth of more exports is probably quite challenged. But like I said at the outset of presenting this particular slide, I would submit that probably the most important aspect of making sure that our targets are reached and that there's enough seed for export and enough seed for crush is that we see an increase in the output of canola. So I will now dive into some of the aspects related to transportation. And the next three slides are courtesy our friends at Quorum Group. I had some discussions with them in terms of what the rail modes might look like going forward as a result of expanded crush. So currently it's about a 50-50 split in terms of what's produced in Canada for canola, equal parts are exported and equal parts are crushed here in Canada. And at the moment, that translates into, in terms of rail mode, about 20% of the canola moves by oil tankers and 80% moves by hopper car. And when we talk about tank cars, that's for the oil, and for the hopper cars, that's both for the meal and for the seed. So assuming we see all the expanded crush announcements come to fruition, we see approximate crush of about 15 million metric tons come 2025. And assuming that we do meet our production target for canola of 26 million metric tons, the breakdown is still pretty even. You do see a little bit more overall crush in terms of production versus seed export, but still, you know, one could argue that it's still a pretty balanced in terms of how much canola goes to seed or to export versus how much goes to crush. And similarly, we don't see a major shift as it relates to the percentage of movement by rail or by hopper car versus tank car. But what's interesting, if we do not see canola production increase, these pie charts change dramatically. So if we see canola production stay relatively flat as it has been over the last 5 or 6 years, so assuming about 20 million metric tons come 2025 instead of our target of 26, the crush of 15 million metric tons represents 81% of all of the canola that is grown in this country, and only about 20% would then be destined for export. We also see a significant shift as it relates to the amount of tank cars, or the amount of canola that would end up moving by tank cars. So 33% by 2025, and then another 57% by hopper car movement. So traffic flows as it relates to our crush expansion. As the previous charts illustrated, we do envision more tank car oil movements overall. We actually do envision more shipments in North America. And again, that's primarily due to that market of biofuels really coming online in the next 5 or 10 years. So we continue to see large opportunities in the United States. You will recall from my earlier comments at the outset of the presentation where we talk about the fundamentals of demand for our products, and that the US market has kind of started to plateau. That's not going to be the case, we think, over the next 5 to 10 years. The US market will continue to be a priority, and a growing priority perhaps. And what's interesting as well is we see the potential for the Canadian market to grow. The Canadian market is traditionally a small market, a market that's stable, but hasn't always seen a lot of growth. And any growth that we have seen over the last 10 years in Canada has in fact been due to biofuels. So if we see biofuels playing a more prominent role in Canada as well, the Canadian market becomes a lot more interesting than maybe it once was. That's not to take anything away from the West Coast. I know when it comes to grain, and even for products like canola oil and meal, the West Coast is imperative, and we really don't see that changing. The West Coast opportunities to ship to Asian markets, whether it's China or whether it's other markets that are growing and moving up the middle class, these are going to continue to be important markets for both canola oil and meal. So last slide, and just a summary and considerations that hopefully does get some discussion going. Again, value-added processing benefits the entire canola value chain and the Canadian economy. Biofuels is the catalyst for these new investments, but food markets really are a critical priority and will continue to be so for canola. What we really need out of governments is for these biofuel policies and regulations to be predictable and create the right demand signal. It's a created market. It's something that does rely 100% on government regulation. So these need to be predictable for the markets to work. Growing canola supplies and productivity increases are critical. I mean, I can't say this enough. In fact, there's a whole other presentation that should probably be given on that particular subject. We need more canola to be grown in this country. And then from the logistics point of view, we view that the structure of how canola is moved could change significantly. And I think it's pretty clear from some of the previous slides I demonstrated, there's a likely shift from export hopper car movement to oil tank cars and meal and hoppers. And when we talk about more oil in tank cars and meal and hoppers, this is all going to be supplied by the member companies of COPA. So the tank and hopper cars that are being utilized by crushers in Canada are private equipment, which is an interesting dynamic and differs from what we see in the traditional grain handle. An increased focus on North American destinations for oil. I think I've made that point several times. There certainly is the potential for fewer seed exports. So one of the slides I demonstrated was, as much as 80% of what's produced here in Canada could be crushed here in Canada. So less opportunities perhaps for seed exports, but that's only if we don't see more canola grown in this country. And we are optimistic that we can start to see productivity increases in canola production. And then lastly, because of this boom in biofuel use, there certainly is a possibility for more dedicated and, what's interesting, more local movement between crusher and renewable diesel producers. So the best example I suppose I could give is in Saskatchewan. We have all that crush expansion occurring, and if there was to be a renewable diesel plant that has been announced and comes to fruition, it's relatively close to where the crushing and the expansion is taking place. So it wouldn't necessarily require as much time to cycle those tank cars from crusher origin to renewable diesel destination. So that's quite tantalizing in terms of a significant efficiency gain. And then the volumes that these renewable diesel plants might require as it relates to canola oil demand. We're not talking about 4 or 5 tank cars at a time. We're talking about 40, 50, maybe even 100 tank cars at a time to feed these biofuel plants. So there's also the possibility of replacing some of the manifest traffic that is more commonly associated to when we move our canola oil. So I hope that this does spur some discussion, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Janelle, as well. We've had several questions roll in, and I'll just take them kind of in order that they were received. And we do have ample time according to our schedule, so I hopefully the answers to these questions will spur for a further round of questioning. So we'll start with 2 questions for Janelle. Janelle, pardon my Spanish here, but frijoles, beans, are a traditional staple of Mexico. Does Canada play a role as a supplier to that market, to your knowledge?
Very minor. I think a lot of the bean production here in Canada goes into domestic consumption. There's a lot more efforts to increase canning and whole consumption within Canada. But I would have to take a look at the numbers. I do think that there would be some that would go to that market.
Thanks. Another one for you, Janelle, another quick hit here. As far as, you talked about the container crunch issue and it was spoken about earlier this morning. So the question is, are international buyers, are they understanding of the current shipping problems, or is this likely to have any impact on the Canadian market for lentils?
I think it's just the lead time is the biggest issue. So having there's issues with Canadian exporters just trying to figure out how long it's going to take to get it to their customers. And it more relates back to the farmers, where some of these companies, they don't necessarily might not have the cash flow just to pay the farmers. And that's kind of where it gets caught up, is in the middle, where the exporters kind of taking a lot of the hit. And that's where we're really trying to advocate for the Canadian government to take a look at what's going on here in the Canadian industry and try to see what could be done.
Okay. Chris, one for you. Is there any advantage to using canola oil versus soybean oil for the production of biofuels?
I'd say by and large, the 2 main vegetable oils in North America, canola and soy, are interchangeable. I think where canola has the advantage is in the way that canola is grown. So our farmers in Western Canada are and have adopted sustainable production practices such as zero and no-till, which actually does lead to a significantly lower carbon intensity score for canola. And my previous comment with regards to what these policies and regulations in places like California are prioritizing, it's the lower carbon intensity feedstock, the lower carbon intensity biofuel, the better. So canola has an advantage in that area just by virtue of the practices that our farmers have been adopting over the last couple of decades.
Chris, there's a comment here from Chris Ferris that I think everyone can see, and maybe I'll just read out his comment for those who might just be on audio only, and then I think this might lead into a bit of a question for you as well, naturally. But the comment is that switching to higher crushed canola supply and disposition in Canada will mean some important and interesting use of the meal portion of the crop. Food use of canola meal will be a really important means of using that canola meal portion. So that's the comment. And I guess, Chris, we can kind of pivot that into a question. Certainly, when you looked at the impact of the increased crush with ideally higher levels of production, you did, with the 42-44% oil of the seed and then the corresponding remainder being meal. What do you and what do your members in your industry see as that opportunity? Where's that meal going to go? And is the food uses, I suppose, for human or new human outlets or maybe animal? Can you just maybe unpack that a little bit as far as response to Chris Ferris's comment on that issue?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it. And it is a big consideration in terms of, where is this meal going to find a home? And it's really going to be, an all of the above when it comes to, where this meal might be destined as a result of the increased crushing that we anticipate here. So human applications as a food is certainly on the table. I think one of the companies that Janelle mentioned in her presentation, Merit, is doing some very interesting things as it relates to using canola as a high protein or deriving a high protein product from it. So that's something that I would submit all of the member companies are exploring as an opportunity. But fundamentally, just with regards to the volumes that are going to be coming out of this expanded crush, meal will continue to be used primarily, we think, in animal feed rations. And it's going to take a little bit of work, I guess, to identify the right markets. The easy answer is China. They have an insatiable appetite for proteins in terms of use in their animal husbandry and aquaculture industries. But we're going to have to look beyond China as well. And again, to piggyback on what Janelle was saying, diversification is so key. You don't want to be beholden to a single market. And I would say that we would likely be looking into other Asian destinations for canola meal as well, for, again, animal husbandry and aquaculture applications. So that could be Southeast Asia, for example. But those are just some spitballing concepts and ideas of where we think the meal might go. But I'd be the first to admit more work needs to be done in that area to identify where those markets are.
Janelle, does that question, are there implications for the pulse sector as well, as far as increased processing? I'm not quite as familiar with the output of that process, but are there considerations for those kind of perhaps lower value in the marketplace byproducts of your various production processes?
Yeah, particularly on the protein side of things, the biggest concern is the starch fraction, because it represents the majority proportion of the seed. So you have so much more of that for every unit of protein. And everybody's talking about the protein, but there's not a lot of attention on the starch side of things. So it's definitely something that we're looking at finding new homes for. And at the moment, the highest volumes are going into lower value applications like animal feed or pet food, where you can really push the volume, but there really is a lot of efforts to trying to find higher value applications to really support those processors. And that's where I would agree, we're looking beyond just food into non-food uses and really diversify the ends and home for that starch fraction.
Okay, next question in the queue, we're going to go back over to Chris. Chris, you can take off your economist hat and put on your agronomy hat for this one. Is COPA, and I guess by extension the council, are you concerned about the threat of diseases and pests? For instance, blackleg and the impact of blackleg meeting production targets. And if you do know the answer to this, the question is, who is funding that research? Can you take a crack at that?
I'll take a crack. So it's a great question, and clearly issues around disease are some of those key yield robbers as we talk about, the limitations of productivity increases in this country on canola. So there's lots of work, there's lots of research being done to mitigate the impact of those yield robbers. I will say, I don't know much about the research, I apologize, but happy to follow up offline and put you in contact to the right people at the Canola Council who can speak to it. But certainly when it comes to canola and getting to our 26 million metric ton target, and how important it is to get there so that we can continue to see this kind of expansion in value-added processing, it's going to be on productivity increases. We don't really see the opportunity to expand the acreage of canola production very much. And the target that the Canola Council has set is that by 2025, we would see 22 million acres of canola, and we would see yields increase from about 40 bushels an acre to 52 bushels an acre. So we have a ways to go, and managing these diseases is a really critical part of it.
Yeah, and I see there's a couple questions here in the queue that are, you answered the first one, and I'm wondering, Janelle, from your perspective, I mean, both canola obviously and the pulse sector have designs on growth long term. There's a question here, maybe a nuance on that theme that Chris just talked about, but what do you see, and I think you might have alluded to it in your earlier slides, but around kind of aspired levels of production, and can you make any comments just from maybe your more area of expertise about, is there any kind of competition in Western Canada in the large growing areas between canola and pulses and soybeans for the actual acreage, right? Can you maybe, to whatever degree you're comfortable, can you unpack that?
Yeah, I would say in terms of canola, not really. They really fit well into crop rotations with crops like canola. So especially too on the protein side of things, I mean, Merit's the first facility to actually produce commercial canola protein isolates, but they're doing so with pea protein isolates. They're very complementary in terms of their protein properties and amino acid score. So I wouldn't say that necessarily would be a problem. On the soybean side of things, both being legumes and nitrogen fixing crops, they would have similar positions within crop rotations, and that's where you might start to see some competition, particularly on the protein side. Soy protein is definitely the most highly used, and pea protein is growing, almost capitalizing and cannibalizing some of that soy protein market. But in Canada, I might be mistaken, but I don't think there even exists a soy protein processing facility at the moment. I think there was an announcement of one that's supposed to be coming up and running in the near future, but right now, it doesn't seem to be a competing factor on the processing side of things.
Okay. Back to Chris and the biofuel file, and again, the implications of that for your members and thinking about investment. I guess this is really a question about demand destruction for conventional fuel and biofuels, but how will the transition to electric vehicles affect the future demand for biofuel?
That's a good question. Certainly, we're seeing a lot more emphasis on electric vehicles, uptake of electric vehicles, policies that incentivize electric vehicles. So I think it's fair to say that the age of electric vehicles is well underway. But these are vehicles that are used in, primarily passenger transport, light duty vehicles, essentially. So they're using gasoline, of course, now, and then transitioning to electric vehicles. When we talk about biofuels from the perspective of diesel, renewable diesel and biodiesel, these are fuels that are used in heavy equipment. So think big construction equipment, think train locomotives, think marine transport, and sustainable or jet fuel and moving people around by plane. The movement towards electrifying those aspects of our economy are a lot more difficult. There's certainly a lot of good work being done to try to electrify, but that's probably still 30, 40 years out. Like maybe not that far out, but certainly it's not as close as we see to electrification of transport for light duty. So all that to say, there certainly is some demand destruction, if you will, for EVs in the light duty area. But we actually see growing opportunities for biofuels to decarbonize aspects of transportation that are harder to do so. So again, I think some examples are jet fuel and diesel fuel used locomotives.
Thanks for that. The next one is about infrastructure, and I'll pose it to Chris first, and then Janelle, if you want to tack on any perspective from the kind of the lens of the pulse and special crop supply chain. But Chris, do you anticipate there will be sufficient terminal infrastructure in place at Vancouver and Prince Rupert to achieve the forecast level of exports offshore for products like meal and oil in the horizon of the next 5 to 10 years? Can you provide any comment on that?
Sure. So on the oil front, there's a risk there. Like I said in my slides, the West Coast is going to continue to play a very important role to get both our oil and meal to market destinations. And on the oil front, again, China is a growing market. Japan is going to be tariff-free for canola oil come 2023. So we want to continue to target these markets, but there are some question marks around the fobbing capacity for canola oil on the West Coast. So let's call that a question mark at the moment and a risk. As it relates to canola meal, which is primarily shipped in a pelleted form, it can use existing grain terminal infrastructure to move those pellets. It's not ideal, I understand, from those that move grain off the West Coast to use those existing facilities because meal is a bit finicky in terms of how it does move through the system. But I'd say that there, at the moment, there seems to be sufficient capacity to move the meal offshore should we need to.
Janelle, I'm not sure, we heard from Raymond this morning, really interesting presentation about, what was going on in 2019 versus today. I'm not sure, is there anything else you'd like to add from your lens about just where you might see your supply chain going 5 to 10 years from now?
Yeah, I would probably not much to add on what was maybe already said here. I mean, I'm a food scientist by trade, so really new into the whole supply chain, all of these issues and everything. But everyone that's speaking here today, I would be much better equipped to have an idea on what's going to be projected for the future.
I have one here that maybe I'll pose to both of you. And again, it's more on the genetics research side of thing, linking that to increased levels of production. But, for instance, so maybe Chris to start with canola and then Janelle on your side of the ledger. Do you see genetics and research being the key to more canola production and then pulse and special crop production? Or how do you see that how do you see extra production coming? How or where do you see extra production coming from?
Genetics are going to have to play a key role, and there's some interesting ways to get at it. It's not always just a question, at least for canola, to increase the bushels per acre. Like it is, don't get me wrong, I think that's the target, but there's also some innovative means to perhaps increase the oil content for every bushel of seed that is grown per acre. So it's not just a question of increasing the bushels per acre, but in some cases, there's opportunities to increase the oil content. But I think, from my point of view, genetics probably has the biggest role to play as it relates to increasing our productivity for canola production across this country. And I'd say, fertility, access to the proper fertilizers, things of that nature is a very close second, if you will.
Janelle, any thoughts from your sector?
Yeah, I would say the genetics point that Chris was speaking to is going to be really important. And I think the pulse sector is really interesting, where traditionally, I think the definition of quality, it has changed, where traditionally, since being sold in a bulk commodity market, it was more related to physical seed characteristics, the color of the seed. And now we are really seeing a shift in research and genetic development for varieties that are particularly perhaps more well suited for this processing industry in terms of their protein content or protein quality, in terms of the amino acid profile, their physical characteristics in terms of how they can actually physically run through the process. So I think it's definitely going to be a top priority, and we are seeing a lot more investments from at least the provincial organizations into looking at breeding new varieties and research into growing these a little bit better and maybe hopefully get that yield at the same time as that protein levels that we want to see in the processing side of things.
And Janelle, maybe I'll just pose a follow-up. As far as peas and your lentils and your other commodities that are within your your purview there at Pulse Canada, with your major international buyers that you'd flagged in some of your slides, do they really care about the actual variety they're getting from Canada, or is a pea as far as whatever that class is? Like, I'm thinking about, on the wheat side, there's specific, properties you need for the type of bread and whatnot. Can you just unpack a little bit about, like, are those buyers, are they going back and are they looking for specific varieties from Canada, or is it just a pea?
I would say traditionally, it probably was more of a pea scenario, but now as we're getting a little bit more refined and we're understanding quality of peas for processing, we're definitely seeing more and more of these companies that are sourcing particular varieties. So that could be in terms of the protein content alone. There's some varieties that just naturally will have a higher protein content regardless of where you're growing it. But there's also other types of yellow peas that perhaps they shatter really easily and they're not necessarily ideal for processing. So we're definitely moving down the line to, I think maybe 10, 20 years out would be in a similar situation as the wheat industry, where there's very specialized varieties that are well suited for processing, and then perhaps others that are more adaptable and well suited for whole consumption. So I think we'll start to see some level of optimization there in terms of the pulse industry, but it's definitely only just getting started, and that's a new conversation for our side of things.
Thanks. Chris, over to you and the oilseed processing environment this year. What impact has the low carry-in and the lower production this year due to the drought had on slowing down the pace of domestic crush?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the scarcity of seed has definitely impacted the ability to run at the rates that we have become familiar with. And when I talk about being kind of familiar with the rates over the last couple of years, we've used about 90% of the capacity that we have. And that's essentially as good as it gets. So if you can run your assets at 90%, you're doing terrific, and everyone's doing their job in the supply chain, by and large. But with tight supplies and just market dynamics at the moment, we're currently running at roughly 80% of utilization crop year to date. So just to give a flavor, I guess, of what that impact has been thus far.
Janelle, back to you. This is a question from Chris Ferris. We've been hearing that firms are implementing blockchain to trace food through the supply chain. What have you heard about how firms are looking at implementing traceability for pulses?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot more of these companies that are working directly with farmers. Vervaet, for an example, they have a team of agronomists that's their job, is to build those relationships and really that they understand the traceability and where their product is coming from. But we're also seeing a lot more programs and projects to look at traceability throughout the supply chain. So I did mention that one with Farmers Edge and Merit Functional Foods through Protein Industries Canada, but there is another project that was announced by PIC that is all about traceability throughout the supply chain, from the field to the actual food product itself. So that's something I think PIC is looking at a little bit more as well. And there's definitely more to come in terms of traceability for pulses.
Another one for you, Janelle. Could you expand on the potential future for fava beans? Is this another processing opportunity down the road?
Oh, absolutely. That's definitely the one where I think there is going to be a bit of a bigger opportunity. It has less flavor issues. The pea and lentil products, they tend to have bitter and beany and grassy notes, and that's one of the major obstacles into using them in food products. But fava beans have much less flavor intensity than some of these other types of pulse ingredients, and they're a little bit easier to process than other types of beans where the seed is very hard and it's difficult to actually physically grind them down into a product. So they're kind of meet right in the middle in terms of that ease of processability that you get from peas, but then that neutral flavor on the bean side of things, but still being able to fractionate it in an economical way. And we are seeing in terms of innovation. So just for an example, we have access to a database called Mintel, which tracks new product launches, and fava bean ingredients really are rising, and there's a lot more products that are out there that are utilizing these types of ingredients. So I do see a lot of opportunity for that in the future.
One for Chris. Again, thinking about future port infrastructure and means of conveyance of product. Do you see, or is there any role of containers for oil and meal movement in your member supply chain?
Yes, so containers are already largely being used to ship meal, and that's meal often destined to China. It's a great way to actually bring canola meal directly to the interior of China where there is a lot of demand for protein. So yes, containers are currently being used for canola meal shipments. And I would imagine when the container dynamic is more favorable, that will continue into the future as well. On canola oil, predominantly done by bulk, there are opportunities to ship smaller parcels by container in things called flexi tanks. But to my knowledge, most of the oil does still move offshore anyway by bulk vessel.
I'm cognizant of the time. We still have 6 minutes left or 7 minutes left in our allotment, and we're coming down to the end of our questions posed from participants. So feel free to throw anything else in the chat or throw your hand up and we can get you on verbally if you wish. But Chris, I have one here regarding the clean fuel standard, which this participant understands is on track for next year coming into play. And can you just unpack, number one, can you just give a bit of an update of where the CFR is at for this participant? And also for our knowledge, you talked about the biofuel industry as being that driver, but what's the role of the actual oilseed processor? Like, how are they going to extract revenue out of that whole biofuel supply chain? Can you maybe unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So as it relates to the clean fuel regulation or clean fuel standard, the draft regulations were released last December. And we understand that the final regulations are intended for publication in the first half of 2022, likely closer to June or July, a rough kind of target in terms of the information that's been shared by government recently. So we do envision that it will actually become a draft regulation, or sorry, a final regulation by mid-2022, with implementation then expected by the end of 2022. So those are the timelines that we're on, and based on where we are today, we're pretty confident that those are the timelines that are going to be met. Steve, your other question, could you remind me?
Just in the actual biofuel supply chain, what's the role of the actual oil producer?
Oh, sure. So really, the oilseed processor rather, is going to be providing that feedstock, that canola oil or soybean oil, to the biofuel producer. So the renewable diesel producer that is looking to make a low carbon biofuel. So that would be the direct relationship in terms of the crusher and the renewable diesel or renewable fuel producer.
Okay, I'm going to throw it back out to participants. One last call for any questions or comments for our two panelists this afternoon. Okay, I'll keep my eye open here on the side, but I do want to thank both of you for coming and providing your unique perspective from your particular kind of commodity sector. And again, I mean, just from both your respective presentations, that inflection point in the last few years in the pulse world, then obviously in the more recent past with the oilseed, the canola oilseed processors, and really bringing that industrial development and that next order of processing to Canada and Western Canada. So I appreciate both your time and your insight and really digging deep into the issues in the context of this symposium. So thank you, Janelle. Thank you, Chris. And Barry, may I turn it back to you?
Thank you very much, Steve and Janelle and Chris, for your contributions. Really interesting. This dream of processing on the prairies is something that's really long-standing. It's nice to see it taking off. And it also occurs to me from other comments I've heard that the more processing you have, the more livestock industry you can have, because a lot of these byproducts will find their way into the livestock industry too. So there's a double hit in terms of value added to the prairies by doing more processing. We're at 2:41, and we're going to resume at 3 o'clock for our, no, sorry, yes, 3 o'clock for our next session, which is going to be shovels in the ground on grain handling systems. And finally, at the end, we're going to hear a bit of a crystal ball gazing as to what are the scenarios for the future of grain export, which should be very interesting. In any case, I think with this time we'll adjourn. Let everybody a chance for that coffee. I know I need one, and we will resume again at 3 o'clock. So thank you very much.